Yes, we're going back on this issue once again, and it's no less intellectually bankrupt than the last one. I think we have established that orcs are a fictional race, and therefore they should be treated as such. I mean, there are many different types of orcs in this day and age, and it's really difficult to generalize them. You have the standard Tolkien-esque evil orcs, and you have the Elder Scrolls more nuanced take on orcs. My personal favorite is the orcs that doesn't look like an orc but does have giant pair of burgers and will have some good old aggressive cuddling with you. Point is, there are many different types of orcs, and it wouldn't exactly be healthy to generalize them all because not every fictional universe has the same type of orcs. Unfortunately, our intellectually challenged types on Twitter are doing exactly that, basically lumping every depiction of orc into Tolkien orcs even if they have nuance and morality, which kind of highlights their own underlying prejudice. I mean, I know it's Twitter and every discussion in there would only lead to people aggressively tapping their fingers on their letters, most commonly used for provocative and unfriendly words, some of which are incredibly discriminatory, but it's Twitter, and in this particular video, I'm gonna challenge myself to see how many euphemisms of bad words that I can use to dodge YouTube's family-friendly algorithm. The source of all of this intellectual bickering about orcs come from this Twitter user who warns people that the following paragraphs are discriminatory towards people's race. This person describes genuine awe that this unpleasantly expounded pieces of paragraph that contain such derogatory, discriminatory words came out on the most recent edition of Dungeons & Dragons. This person then proceeds to accentuate his astonishment by uttering the word holy, followed by a more crude word to describe fecal matter. I think it's good for us to check out the content of this paragraph to see what has caused such unbridled rage. Since we are talking about the tabletop role-playing game D&D, it's obvious that the rules of role-playing in this game is gonna be illustrated on the rulebook of this game. As we all know, Dungeons & Dragons is a fantasy tabletop RPG that contains several different races that you can roleplay as. With each race, there are going to be different rules and different stats. They also have their own different backgrounds, cultures, personalities, etc. So in order to maintain the authenticity of the universe that these people are roleplaying in, they have to adhere to the lore of the rulebook, unless if they want to have a crack run of D&D where the orcs use laser guns or something, which is basically Shadowrun. As we can see on these paragraphs regarding role-playing as an orc, we are reading at a short but concise description of what it means to be an orc in the universe of Dungeons & Dragons. It reads as follows. Most orcs have been indoctrinated into a life of destruction and slaughter, but unlike creatures who by their very nature are evil, such as gnolls, it's possible that an orc, if raised outside of its culture, could develop a limited capacity for empathy, love, and compassion. So this is less Tolkien and more Elder Scrolls. I personally haven't seen anything that would indicate prejudice towards a certain race, but maybe if we continue reading, we would find such horrific notions that cause all the meltdowns. The paragraph continues. No matter how domesticated an orc might seem, its bloodlust just flows beneath the surface. With its instinctive love of battle and its desire to prove its strength, an orc trying to live within the confines of civilization is faced with a difficult task. In other words, it is possible for orcs to live outside of their culture, but it can be difficult. Again, I am not sensing the prejudice here. The orcs possess overwhelming strength and indomitable will, making them incredibly effective towards scenarios where they have to resolve gruesome conflicts using their physical strength. But they also have a weakness in being unable to fully develop genuine empathy, love, and compassion, especially towards other races. They're not good, but they're not evil either. It's a good race to choose to roleplay as. But that's not what a lot of the brilliant Twitter intellectuals take issues with. What they take issue with is the fact that the prejudice exists at all, and you cannot have prejudice in this tabletop RPG because this is the current year where we are clearly free from all sorts of prejudices and discrimination happening around the world. We are living in a very peaceful time where people from different sorts of race, gender, or ethnicity are living together without any sorts of conflict, and that none of them have any sort of underlying abhorrence and resentment towards other people simply because of their identity. How dare this tabletop RPG game tackles a topic that is simply out of place in our peaceful current year? Actually, no, that would be a much better complaint than what our Twitter intellectuals and saviors of the human race have for today. Let's tackle this first one over here. The first point is indeed true. No one specifically mentioned people with dark skin color. They do, however, compare orcs to non-Europeans, and with the exception of some Asians, there are quite a lot of non-Europeans that don't have like skin. The user continues by saying, how do you not understand that if you normalize this race of people is inherently evil and killing them is always justified, that could cause a problem in the real world? So this person is concerned that this tabletop RPG taking place in a fictional universe where we roleplay as fictional characters could influence our behaviors towards real people in the real world. As you can see, we are dealing with powerhouse intellectuals right here. This is a very misguided assumption about fiction, real life, and basically everything about orcs. A lot of fictional content and materials are clearly made for the entertainment of many people around the world, which is why a lot of them adhere to the standard black and white morality. A lot of Western or Japanese animation clearly adhere to this formula. There's a very good and very clear evil throughout the narrative. Tolkien never intended orcs to be a representation of anyone in real life. They are there serving as the villains of a story. Nothing more, nothing less. However, according to websites like comicbook.com, his depiction of orcs as a monolithic society of evil human-like creatures became a standard element in epic fantasy, which is indeed very true if you discount examples from very small and niche franchises like Elder Scrolls, Warcraft, or even some editions of D&D. The article continues by saying that various artists and authors use elements of various real-world non-European cultures when depicting orcs in books and other media, thus solidifying the idea that orcs were a reflection of non-Europeans, and that's incredibly problematic. The problem of this hastily constructed argument, my dear author of this shoddily written fluff piece, is that it requires the assumption that people who think of orcs would immediately think of real-world non-European people. Perhaps this could be my run and faulty brain thinking out loud, but I do not think people who enjoy fantasy in general assume that orcs are the same as non-European people. I am certain that this is just an error in my way of thinking, and also the error of a lot of people's thinking. It seems to me that my defective and inferior brain assumed that orcs are just orcs, and that there's no reason to compare this fictional entity to a non-fictional entity. But now it's clear to me that the high-minded and brilliant intellectuals of the Twitter crowd have a superior brain that allows them to make such a distant connection between orcs and non-European people. I wanted to bow to the superiority of this intellectual connection, if only it isn't discriminatory and prejudice. As I mentioned before, the good versus evil morality is a very common trait in fiction that works about as well as bread and butter. It's a tried and true formula. However, I do not find the idea of comparing the fictional evil to a non-fictional entity to be either clever or especially respectable. You might remember that a lot of the Harry Potter comparisons that happened in social media during such turbulent times as the 2016 election, comparing political figures that you deem evil as Voldemort or political parties that you deem evil as Death Eaters. I would concur that these sorts of silly comparisons are in a similar spirit of the orc case of today. Both instances contain people comparing malevolent fictional entities with a real-world entity that they deem to be malevolent. Considering these two scenarios, I have to agree on the notion that there are so many big-brain intellectuals who use evil fictional entities in comparison to real-life people or groups of people that they deem to be evil. The difference is that it's perfectly acceptable to put that comparison to the right target, and it's not acceptable to put that comparison to the wrong target. It's perfectly acceptable to make the Death Eater comparisons to whatever sorts of groups that I personally deem immoral or malevolent, but if you do it to the groups of people that I personally deem moral or virtuous or a protected class, you are obviously a terrible person. To put it simply, it's okay when we do it. Personally, I do not care about whatever fictional evil that you use as a comparison to highlight your point against whatever real-life entities that you consider evil at that time of day. You can probably construct a well-thought-out argument out of this silly comparison. What I'm saying is, you do not assume that people are doing the same thing that you are doing. You do not assume that people who think about orcs are automatically gonna think that they're non-European people in the same way that you do. And the funny thing is, prejudice, you don't exactly have an issue making the comparisons. You clearly have an issue in the targets that you're comparing it with. I do not believe that you're concerned that people are gonna make these silly comparisons in real life, because in reality, people already do. They just do them to different people or different groups. Some of which that you deem unacceptable, but some of which are perfectly acceptable. How about we come into a consensus and say that people who make these silly comparisons to justify their misguided sense of morality are all equally foolish. But that's not the only big brain take that our Twitter intellectuals have in regards to this entire situation. Let's take a look at this one. Yes, orcs and goblins and elves aren't real, but the people who play the games are. The people who write the games are. You cannot draw a line between fiction and reality because they feed one another. It's a constant loop. Ah, yes, it looks like we have to make a thought-provoking assumption that fiction is affecting reality, or that our actions in fiction would affect reality. I too remember that moment where I drive recklessly around the beautiful fictional city of Los Santos and pretty much hitting everyone and everything that I see, but I do not recall a time where my reckless driving in that game translates to my actual driving in the real world. I suppose all that time I spent in GTA 5 didn't feed on my reality as much as you do. Actually, if it did affect you, please let me know so that I can inform the cops. This person continues by saying that as game designers, we are responsible for ensuring that ugly, harmful realities do not make it into fiction, because if they do, players would see it and use it to justify themselves and reinforce all sorts of bad behaviors, including prejudice. Would you like to extend that to other bad behaviors like stealing or murder? I assume that you wouldn't be okay to those bad behaviors if prejudice is such a horrible thing to point out. I don't understand why prejudice is this very special bad action that game designers should take seriously, but ending lives are perfectly fine. In fact, you can end lives in however ways you desire, in whatever elements that you see fit. I am well aware that prejudice is something that anyone can have, and the desire to murder people is not something that everyone can have. But that's not my point. My point is that anyone can justify whatever prejudice or foolish actions that they have to whatever things that exist in this world. It's what makes those people self-righteous. It's what warped their sense of morality. It doesn't matter if it's tabletop games or video games, they do not reinforce those behaviors. Prejudice that exists in the real world are reinforced by prejudice that exists in the real world, not prejudice that exists in some completely unrelated fictional fantasy. And that's where I'm gonna conclude this hoopla. The big brain, high-minded intellectuals of the Twitter sphere clearly do not understand the relationship between fiction and reality. They do not understand how asinine it is to compare fictional entities that are actually evil to real-life entities that they deem to be evil. And most importantly, they themselves have their own deeply ingrained prejudices manifested as a virtuous outcry towards the dangers of fictional discrimination. I would suggest these people to take a look at themselves in the mirror before making such a presumptuous assertion about everyone else. And I would suggest you, my wonderful viewers, to support me and this channel by liking, subscribing, or donating through the links down below.